So the next learning objective we're going to look at is the conduct of monetary policy. So how does the Fed basically conduct monetary policy? How does the Fed basically set monetary policy? And in this section, we basically are going to look at three different parts, okay? So the first thing we're going to look at is what is the Fed's monetary policy instrument, okay? Right? How does the Fed make its policy decision? And then third, how does the Fed implement its policy decisions? Okay, so these are the three questions you need to look out for, and these are the three main questions we are going to try and answer. Okay, the first one is the monetary policy instrument. Now, first of all, we need to define a monetary policy instrument. The monetary policy instrument is basically any variable that the Fed can directly control or target to influence monetary policy. Okay, so it's any variable. When we say a variable, it's basically anything that changes, anything that is able to change, a factor that can change, okay? So essentially a factor that is basically malleable, okay? Right, so it's any variable that the Fed can directly control or closely target to influence monetary policy. The Federal Reserve in the United States has two main policy instruments. I'm going to look at those, okay? Well, the first one is the monetary base. When we say the monetary base is basically made up of a sum of currency and deposits in financial institutions. Okay, so deposits in financial institutions like deposits in your checking account or savings account, okay, in financial institutions, okay? So that is the monetary base, okay? So there the Fed can basically directly control the amount of money there and basically use it as a monetary policy tool. Now, the second and the most common one, which the Fed normally uses, is basically what we call the federal funds rate. And you've probably not seen this before, so you probably need to be writing this up. The federal funds rate is basically the interest rate at which banks charge each other when they lend and borrow from each other. Okay, so your local bank, believe it or not, basically borrows money from other banks or basically lends money to other banks, right? Now, if it's borrowing and lending money to other banks, basically it charges what we call the federal funds rate, okay? And the federal funds rate is basically mandated by the Federal Reserves, okay? Right. The Fed basically makes drastic changes to the federal funds rate, and the Fed changes the federal funds rate 0.25% at a time. It's the main tool of the Federal Reserve. Okay, that is the main policy tool of the Federal Reserve. So many people think the Federal Reserve just prints a lot of money. In terms of conducting monetary policy, it tends to be more risky. They do that through the monetary base, but also the main way they control monetary policy or influence monetary policy is basically through the federal funds rate. Now, let's look at historically levels of the federal funds rate in the United States, okay? Now, we have a timeline over here. Over here is our timeline, and we have the federal funds rate. And you can basically see the federal funds rate in terms of over the last 2 decades, okay? Excuse me. So in 2000, basically there was a dot-com bubble and there was a financial recession early in 2000. So the federal funds rate actually decreased. The Federal Reserve decided to decrease the federal funds rate, okay? And then in 2003, 2006, 2007, between 2003 and 2007, there was an economic expansion and the federal funds rate basically increased. We had the financial recession of 2008, 2009, and the federal funds rate decreased, and the federal funds rate has stayed low for quite some time now. Now, let me explain the mechanism behind it. When the Fed wants to avoid a recession, it basically lowers the federal funds rate, okay? So during the dot-com bubble, okay, and that is a recession that happened because a lot of people actually invested in internet companies that were basically not worth any value, right? And that was due to the fact that everyone thought in 1999 that the world was going to be digital, so they just climbed up onto this whole speculation of investing in internet companies, right? Now, this basically burst, so the bubble basically burst and it caused a recession. Now, if the Fed wants to avoid a recession, what does it do? It basically lowers the federal funds rate. Now, the reason it lowers the federal funds rate is again to encourage borrowing and lending. Okay, so to encourage borrowing and lending. Okay, now if banks borrow and lend from each other, it means that banks have more money, and banks, let me let you in on a little secret, are basically the institutions that create money in the country. If banks have more money and more capital, they can basically give out more loans, and they can basically give out money out to people to spend. Now, if people are spending, that will basically increase aggregate demand, hence increase GDP and close the recession. Okay, so that is why the Federal Reserve, when actually an economy is in a recession, or to avoid a recession, basically lowers the federal funds rate. Banks, big banks borrow a lot of money, $1 million, $100 million actually, right? And it basically helps in creating more money. They give out more loans to people, and essentially people spend, and essentially the economy gets out of the recession. Okay, now the federal funds rate also dictates the interest rate at which banks and basically other institutions set their interest rates. Okay, so if the federal funds rate is low, generally market interest rates on car loans or mortgages tend to be low as well. Okay, and that encourages people to spend, and again, you always spend your way out of a recession. Now, if there is an economic expansion and the Fed wants the economy to slow down a bit because it might risk high inflation, the Federal Reserve is basically going to increase the interest rate. Okay, the Federal Reserve is basically going to increase the interest rate and basically raises the federal funds rate. Okay, so between 2003 to 2007, the federal funds rate was basically increased because the economy was basically expanding. Again, when the federal funds rate is increased, banks don't borrow as much from each other. And when they don't borrow as much from each other, basically they can't make loans to people like you and me. And then that discourages spending and the economy basically slows down. Okay. Now, when they also raise the federal funds rate, market interest rates basically increase. And when market interest rates basically increase, people are more reluctant to go for a loan. And hence, that basically decreases spending. Okay. Right. Now, as you notice on this graph, the federal funds rates have been pretty low for a long time. Okay. And it's quite problematic. Okay. So basically, people say we actually in what we call a liquidity trap, where the federal funds rate has been too low for a long time, that people become insensitive towards it. Okay, people become insensitive towards it, and that's another topic for another day. Okay, right. Now, there are three main things the Federal Reserve targets when it's trying to sort of fix the economy, right? So, for example, you go to the hospital, right? There are things the doctor basically checks to make sure you got your temperature, your blood pressure, all those little things, right? Now, your weight, for example. Now, the Federal Reserve also targets three indicators of the economy. I remember saying this, okay? Basically, it looks at GDP, which is basically what the economy is producing at a certain point. It also looks at inflation, and then it also looks at the unemployment rate, okay? So, three indicators of how the economy is doing, okay? And the Federal Reserve basically targets these three things: is the inflation rate, the unemployment rate, and eventually GDP, which is basically determined by the output gap. Okay, so now we look at what the Federal Reserve does when there is an issue with the inflation rate. Okay, first of all, when there's inflation rate, the Federal Reserve will target or look at whether the inflation rate is basically outside of its comfort zone. Remember, the comfort zone is between 1% and 2%. Okay, so it's the inflation rate inside the first comfort zone. Okay, again, if the inflation rate is above the comfort zone, it means that inflation is too high. And the Fed will raise the federal funds rate. Again, when it raises the federal funds rate, it's trying to slow down spending, right? And it's trying to basically lower the inflation rate, okay? So above the comfort zone, that means that inflation is way too high. It's basically above 2%. the Federal Reserve will raise the federal funds rate. Okay. Now, if inflation is below the comfort zone, meaning inflation is less than 1%, it means that inflation is too low, and you're actually risking deflation, and the Fed will decrease the federal funds rate. Again, if it decreases the federal funds rate, it encourages borrowing, okay, and once it encourages borrowing, essentially it increases money supply, and basically people spend more, the economy expands, and inflation goes up again. Okay, right? So that is in terms of inflation rate. Now, what about the unemployment rate? If the unemployment rate is below the natural unemployment rate, remember how we define the natural unemployment rate? The natural unemployment rate is basically the unemployment rate, which is made up of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. If the unemployment rate is below the natural unemployment rate, inflation tends to occur and the Fed will raise the federal funds rate. Now, you're probably wondering to yourself, well, Dr. Kweku, how does inflation occur when the unemployment rate is below the natural unemployment rate? Well, let's look at the mechanism. Well, when it's very low unemployment rate, this will basically cause a labor shortage in the economy because unemployment rate is low. There's basically no workers available to work. Almost every worker has been employed, right? Every time there's a labor shortage or anytime there's a shortage in a market, prices of that good basically tend to rise. And the price of labor is basically wages. So every time there's a labor shortage, the price of labor, which is wages, will increase. Okay? So labor shortage causes wages to basically rise. When wages rise, this is going to affect the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the short-run aggregate supply curve will decrease because it's now expensive to actually produce goods and services. And this will basically cause price levels to increase. Okay, when short-run aggregate supply decreases, the price level essentially increases, as we already saw. Okay, that is cost push inflation. Okay. And the Fed will basically increase the federal funds rate to slow down the inflation rate. Okay. Now the opposite is true. If the unemployment rate is above the natural unemployment rate, lower inflation tends to happen, and the Fed might consider lowering the federal funds rate. Again, let's look at the mechanism. If the unemployment rate is above the natural unemployment rate, it causes a high unemployment rate, and that basically causes labor surplus, okay? So there are a lot of people laid off, so there are a lot of people looking for jobs, so basically it's a labor surplus. Now, every time there's a labor surplus or every time there's a surplus in the market, eventually prices will have to decrease. We'll learn this in chapter 3. Prices will eventually have to decrease, okay? So the labor surplus will cause wages to eventually decrease, okay? When wages decrease, this will cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to increase, okay? So we have the short-run aggregate supply curve over here. We have the AB curve over here. We have the price level over here. We have GDP over here. Your short-run aggregate supply increases because it's less costly to produce, so people produce more goods and services. Their price level will basically decrease. Okay, so when the price level is decreasing, it's basically essentially causing deflation, and essentially the Fed will have to lower the federal funds rate in order to spare money supply, increase money supply, and increase people to basically spend. Okay, so the price level decreases and the Fed will decrease the federal funds rate. Now let's take a look at the output gap. Okay, now if the output gap is positive, it means that actual GDP is higher than potential GDP. So the economy is producing a lot of goods and services, so there's an inflationary gap, and inflation will basically accelerate. Every time there's high inflation rate, you guessed right, the Federal Reserve will raise the federal funds rate. Again, conversely, if the output gap is negative, it's a recessionary gap and inflation will decrease. And anytime there's a recession, the Federal Reserve will lower the federal funds rate in order to get people to spend more. Okay, so the Federal Reserve will lower the federal funds rate This will increase money supply and loans made by banks. Okay, this will increase the AD curve, and that will basically increase GDP and will basically cause the output gap to basically close. Right, now let's do a real quick class activity. So again, the class activity is basically just to reinforce what you've basically sort of learned already, okay, so that is ingrained in your mind. Okay, now monetary policy is too important to be left to the Fed. The president should be responsible for it. Do you agree with the statement or disagree with the statement? Okay, so that is something you have to think about. Do you agree with the statement? And if you agree with the statement, why? Do you disagree with the statement? And if you disagree with the statement, why? Okay, and how is responsibility of monetary policy allocated among the Fed, the Congress, and the president? Remember, with the Fed, basically monetary policy is the sole mandate of the Federal Reserve. With Congress plays no role in monetary policy, and the president of the United States basically plays no role in the monetary policy as well. It's the duty of the United States president to just appoint the chairman of the Fed and the board of governors of the Federal Reserve. Now, explain the two main monetary policy instruments and which does the Fed use the most. The two main monetary policy instruments are basically the monetary base, and we say the monetary base is what? A sum of currency and deposits in financial institutions. And then we have the federal funds rate, and the federal funds rate is the interest rate the Fed basically allows banks to charge each other when they decide to basically lend and borrow. Okay, now which does the Fed use the most? Basically, the Fed uses the federal funds rate the most. Okay, now you need to understand how the federal funds rate works. If the federal funds rate is increased, so federal funds rate increases, banks basically don't borrow as much from each other. They don't have enough capital to lend to their customers, and money supply basically decreases. If money supply basically decreases, this helps in decreasing the price level. Okay, right, now if the federal funds rate increases, like I already explained, if it decreases, money supply increases because banks will borrow more from each other, lend more to each other, to do a lot of transactions. When money supply increases, aggregate demand increases, and every time demand increases, the price level tends to increase as well. Again, guys, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and I'll see you in the next section of our video. Thank you.